In the following, you will listen to a presentation by Georgia Danos, Sarah Self, and Fabian Rempfer. But before we are going to start our presentation about the Atlantic slave trade, you are going to watch a short clip about American slavery. Here too, please click on the link provided in the first slide and wait until the clip is loaded, and you are good to go. Having heard several important facts about the American slavery in general, we are now going to talk more about the Atlantic slave trade in terms of where did the slaves come from, where were they brought to, and how many slaves existed in the Americas approximately. In addition to that, you are going to hear about several laws that were passed over the years and their consequences for the black slave. Last but not least, Sarah is going to inform you about religious aspects at that time, such as how did they justify slavery with claiming to be Christians, and so on and so forth. So let's get started with the second slide. This picture depicts the several different routes the slave traders took in order to transport slaves to their final destination. This whole Atlantic slave trade existed from approximately the 15th to the late 19th century, and this trade occurred within the broader system of trade between West and Central Africa, Western Europe, the Caribbean, and North and South America. It is also known under the definition of the largest long-distance forced movement of people in history. It is estimated that over 9 million African men, women, and children were enslaved and transported to the Americas. One interesting fact, though, is that most people have always believed that it was just the colonizers who came to Africa and captured Africans in order to enslave them. However, that is not completely true, since there were many African chiefs who not only sold their own people to the white men, but also ordered to capture other Africans in order to be able to trade or sell them. European traders, for instance, exchanged metals, cloth, beds, guns, and ammunition for captive Africans brought to the coast from the African interior. The slaves to be were bought and sold by European slaveholders as chattel property to be used for their labor and skills. Chattel property, according to the Legal Information Institute at Cornell University, to all category of property mostly associated with movable goods. At common law, chattel included all property that was not real estate and not attached to real estate. Examples included everything from leases to cows to clothes, etc. This basically hints at slaves not being human beings, but property without any rights whatsoever. After being brought to the coast through other Africans, these enslaved Africans were then held in fortified slave castles such as Elmina in the central region, now Ghana, Gorée Island, now in present-day Senegal, and Bounce Island, now in present-day Sierra Leone, by the European traders. Before they were forced onto ships for the Middle Passage that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. From there on, they headed directly to the New World. Yet not only did many captives die during the long journey over water from Africa to the West Indies and to the Americas in general, but also during the overland journey from the interior to the coast. And scholars even estimate that between 10 and 19% of the African slaves died during the journey on sea due to rough conditions on slave ships. Those who arrived at various ports in the Americas were then sold in public auctions or smaller trading venues to plantation owners, merchants, small farmers, prosperous tradesmen, and other slave traders. Slaves were also sold on to other Caribbean islands or into North or South America. However, predominantly European slaveholders purchased enslaved Africans to provide labor that included domestic service, field work, or even artisanal work, which means that they were able to make things by hand. The majority, however, provided agricultural labor and skills to produce plantation cash crops for national and international markets. Slaveholders used profits from these exports to expand their land holdings and purchase more enslaved Africans, perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade cycle for centuries until various European countries and new American nations officially ceased their participation in the trade in the 19th century, though illegal transatlantic slave trading continued even after national and colonial governments issued legal bans. Continuing with the next slide, These pictures show where African slaves originally came from. As you can see, most slaves came from the west coast and Central Africa, and as aforementioned, they were brought to specific points from where they were put on slave ships and brought to the Americas. As you can see, the names of the countries were obviously different from the today names, due to the fact that there was no such thing as an African country. There were kingdoms and maybe provinces, but no real countries. Colonizers gave specific areas names such as Senegambia, Gold Coast, or Old Calabar. Going on to the next slide, we are presented a map of today's countries in Africa in order for you to be able to get an idea where exactly the slaves came from. As you can see, the area encompasses from the western northern part Senegal over Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria or Nigeria until Democratic Republic of the Congo in the Central West region. You can also notice that there are still many names left that originated in the colonial period. For instance, in Gabon, Libreville, which means free village, or in Nigeria, Porto Novo, New Harbor, both used to be colonized by Portuguese. From now on, the slides depict tables and statistics which will be explained by me, and the most important numbers will be highlighted. The first slide that shows various numbers and countries depict the amount of slaves that were brought to the West Indies by European countries. Therefore, the numbers represent the amount of people that each country deported to the so-called New World. As noticeable, Portugal and Britain were the first to capture Africans and bring them to the Americas. However, only to name a few numbers, one can see that Portugal represents the country that deported most Africans during the period of 1519 to 1700, with around 55.75% of all deported slaves. Britain is on second position, yet only with 28.23%, which is half as many as Portugal. Taking a closer look at the period from 1701 to 1800, Britain increased its slave trade and deported up to 40.55% of all the slaves to the Americas, whereas Portugal decreased its number to 30.89%. Countries like the United States do not have a representative number shown in the earlier time span, since the US we know today did not exist during that time. Yet in the second part it is noticeable that the United States is only on fourth position with 3.26% of all the deported slaves, which is less than Britain, Portugal, the Netherlands and France. The picture beneath the table shows a pie chart in order to illustrate every country better. As noticeable, Portugal and Britain possesses the biggest pieces, followed by France and the Netherlands. The next slide and table, plus pie chart, show a table depict the countries from which slaves were captured and deported to the West Indies. Again, there are two different time spans. The first one reaches from 1519 to 1700, and the second one from 1701 to 1800. In the first period, it becomes obvious that West Central Africa possesses the biggest numbers of embarkations, with 60.59 of all the embarkations at that time. It is followed by Bight of Benin with only 0.02%, and the Gold Coast with 6.69%. Both numbers are less than the number from West Central Africa. This big difference can be explained through the assumption that West Central Africa merely realized earlier that you can make a lot of money through selling slaves to the white man, therefore its number are the highest. In the second period, West Central Africa is still on top of all the other countries, however they lost many percentages and came down to 38.41%. Countries like Bight of Benin or Biafra and the Gold Coast with 14.31% increased their numbers due to the fact that they improved their infrastructure and the amount of captures. They realized the lucrativeness of human trade. The next slide again represents a pie chart in order to illustrate the difference between the African countries. As one can see, West Central Africa has the biggest piece, followed by Bight of Benin and Bight of Biafra. The next slide shows again a chart which represents the places they were brought to from Africa. Again, there is a differentiation between the two time spans. In the first one, it is noticeable that most slaves were brought to Spanish American mainland, such as at the time South America, for instance, Brazil, and other territories. It is followed by Barbados, a little side note that is the place where Equiano was brought to, for example, with 16.93%, which lies in the Caribbean West Indies. On third position, there is Guyana with 14.31%, which are located in South America. Taking a closer look at British mainland and North America, it is surprisingly that only 1.9% were deported to this part of the world. The second period, however, depicts great changes. For instance, Santo Domingo, which increased its number from 1.78% to 39.53%. Spanish American mainland lost more than 50% and dropped to 2.92%. British mainland North America increased a lot too, to 13.92%. Labor in those areas got more important by the day, thus more workers were needed. Here again, a pie chart is provided to illustrate the amount of people. Spanish American mainland, Dutch Caribbean, Guianas, and Barbados depict the biggest pieces, not North America, since most of the time when people talk about slavery, they always refer to American slavery, which is in fact a lot smaller in numbers than Spanish slave trade. The last slide summarizes the total number of deported slaves during 4 periods. First one from 1451 to 1600, with 1/4 Second, from 1601 to 1700, with 1.3 million. Third, 1701 to 1811, with 6 million. And fourth, 1811 to 1870, with 2 million. Therefore, one can claim that the best estimates suggest that between 1451 and 1817, when the transatlantic slave trade ended, over 9 million people were transported from Africa to be enslaved in the New World. With this being said, Georgia is taking over from here and is talking about several laws which were passed over the years.
It all started in 1502, when the first reported African slaves came into the New World, also known as America. In 1793, hundreds of white refugees came into the United States ports, fleeing the insurrection in Santo Domingo. In 1751, South Carolina imposed a special tax on foreign slaves to try and slow the slave trade down, but 9 years later, they banned it again altogether because the leaders of the colonies were scared of the growing number of African-born slaves. In 1764, the colony proposed new taxes on African-born slaves because the legislator was scared of the number of rising African slaves that were being born. But in 1794, the United States Congress passed legislation prohibiting the manufacturing, fitting, equipping, loading, or dispatching of any vessel to be employed into the slave trade.